welcome to a new episode of the Good Old Podcast. I'm Jacquie Franciulli for Wahoo's 24/7. And spring football is back in Charlottesville. The Cavaliers will be kicking off spring practice on Monday. It's the first chance that we'll get to see the new transfers in action. 19 of those coming to Virginia. But before we get going, I want you to go ahead, like this video, like this channel so they can continue to get notifications when new videos are posted on YouTube, and go ahead and leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast. Now, as you can tell, if you're on YouTube, you'll see a double box and you see Greg Madia in one of the screens. So, Greg, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be with you, Jackie. Spring football, it's here, starts Monday, so should be exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it's been such a hectic off season. It doesn't feel like we ever got away from football, right?
No, I mean think about what's transpired since the Virginia Tech game in the regular season finale, right? It's been a total overhaul of the roster, particularly on the offensive and defensive lines. There are two new quarterbacks in town. The former quarterback is at another school at UNLV, and Anthony Calandria. The Who's have two new QBs on campus. So it's going to be a fascinating spring just because there are so many new players. The coaching staff's all back, right? I mean, everybody's back from that standpoint. There's some continuity there, but you're gonna have to install offense, defense from I don't know if from square one is the right term, but at least at a pace where all your newcomers can grasp it and understand it. So I think there's a lot to this spring, and it's an important spring for Tony Elliott and his Cavaliers.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they knew where they needed to go and attack the portal. I mean, they knew the trenches was such a big issue for them depth-wise, so they really attacked it. And usually when we're talking about the portal and you see two new quarterbacks go in, that's where you're thinking, okay, that's the first topic of discussion. But honestly, for me, the offensive line is the biggest topic going into spring because I mean, if you look at the numbers that they brought in, I mean, that's a practically new starting offensive line for Virginia. You can argue that, Noah Josie, Mikhail Boley are probably the two that I feel like could probably, rotate in the starting lineup. Those are the two that you're thinking of. But because they're not available in the spring, we could see 5 new names on the O-line starting in the spring.
Yeah, from the outset. I mean, it's going to be a kind of look and see exactly what you have. I think that's part of the evaluation with the offensive line. You have an idea that Monroe Mills, who was one of the more highly rated transfers in this class, you have an idea that he's probably going to play one of the two tackle spots. He played left or right and right. He started 5 at each side at Louisville this past season. He played left and right tackle at his previous stop, Texas Tech, before that. So you're just going to figure out probably what side he fits best on. But from there, I think you have to figure out what you have in Kevin Wigginton, who transferred in from Illinois. Did not play a lot at Illinois, but had started and started 6 games at Michigan State. Brady Wilson, who's in from UAB, is a likely center. But you also have Drake Metcalf coming back from injury after he transferred in last year and was supposed to be someone who could help the Who's offensive line. He's a center in his past stops at both UCF and Stanford, though he could play guard too. Tyshawn Wyatt's in from James Madison. He played. He's got the most starts of anybody on the Virginia roster who's played on the offensive line. I think 33 in his career between playing guard and tackle at JMU. So you'll see where he fits in. I think that's part of what Terry Heffern and the offensive line coach has to determine this spring is who's going to play where, what's the best combinations. It's a fascinating spring for that whole line.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned Drake Metcalf, when he first brought in, he was repping behind Brian Stevens at center for some of those things, although they kind of were content to know Hartzell getting that role before he got hurt in the spring. And he kind of had that role at right guard. That's where most of his reps were before his Achilles injury. So it'll be interested to see if he goes in that slot. And then what's the question about Blake Steen? Will he move inside where he first initially was slotted? With Virginia bringing in more tackle options. So it's a lot of questions in that O-line. And honestly, that is the biggest thing for Virginia because last year we saw what happens. You may have a playmaker at quarterback, but if your O-line doesn't have the depth needed, you're going to have problems.
Yeah, I mean, your quarterback will be running for his life, kind of like Anthony Calandria was at times this past fall, and then even Tony Muskett in the last game there against Virginia Tech, he was having to run a little bit. I thought he made some better decisions than Calandria, but it was tough, tough situation when the O line couldn't protect the quarterback a season ago, and that's what Virginia's got to fix. They got to find solutions and continue to progress the running game. I think Virginia, you saw some good things from Virginia early in the year running the football when maybe the schedule was a little bit more comparable to in competition to what Virginia is. Ran the ball really, really well in a game against Coastal Carolina. Xavier Brown had 171 yards. You got to continue to progress that, and maybe that can also help your quarterback situation in that there's not so much pressure to protect him all the time. You got to stay ahead of the chains and make sure that running game's there so that you have a multi-threat offense in terms of running and throwing the ball.
Yeah, the running back position is what I'm interested in watching this spring because that's a position that I feel Virginia could reinforce in the spring portal, depending on how things go in the spring. Obviously, you return Xavier Brown, you have Jack Greasy, which Virginia is really high on. You add Jamari Taylor from the transfer portal, but you lose Dante Hawthorne for a medical issue, so you lose him from the team. So, and your numbers weren't exactly great. So that's something where I think Virginia might enter the portal in the spring, depending on how kind of things shakes up there at running back. And then you compile that with the question at quarterback now. They went into the portal knowing they needed to after Anthony Calandria's decision. They highlighted Chandler Morris and Daniel Kalen. I mean, I think that was one position where Virginia got two of the two that they kind of aimed for. And they got two guys. One, Chandler Morris obviously is a veteran, and Daniel Kalen is a guy that they can see kind of get into that role and mature a little bit under the Virginia offense. And what you get is two guys who kind of mirror a little bit Anthony Calandria. I think Chandler Morris is someone that, if we compare Anthony Calandria, he's a more mature version of Anthony Calandria, a guy more experienced with him, has some of the same traits. Would you kind of agree there that's when you're kind of comparing apples to apples, that's you kind of see Calandria a little bit there?
Yeah, you see a little bit of the same skill, a lot of the same skill set. I think what's fascinating to me and what you're going to want to see from Morris this spring is how he adjusts from playing in the air raid, which he had played in really throughout his career. If you think about his three stops, Oklahoma, TCU, and most recently North Texas, it's air raid, sling the ball a little bit all over the yard to Virginia's more balanced, more pro style system. And I think, there'll be elements that translate, but you're going to want to see how he takes a snap under center. And when I spoke to him, a couple of months ago, he, not long after he committed, he had said something along the lines of like, you need to learn how to do that and get comfortable with that in the spring to help progress his own game forward. So he was excited about some of those things it could offer him from a quarterback development standpoint at Virginia. But I think his experience, remember, like before he got hurt, he was TCU's starter the year they went to the national championship game. He got hurt and ended up never getting that job back until the next year. But he was part of that team and good enough then to beat out Max Duggan, who ended up being the quarterback down the stretch and through their run to the title game. So that tells you about the skill set he has, the high level of talent that people see in him. And I think it helps with his connections, which have been well documented by now, to Tony Elliott and the Cavaliers' coaching staff, going back to his father's time as Clemson's offensive coordinator, and Tony Elliott working there under Chad Morris. So I think for me, they'll figure out ways to make it work with him, and you just want to see how he transitions from one drastically different offense to what Virginia does.
Yeah, you touched on the relationships. I think it's quite remarkable that in the portal era, Virginia really honed in on the two quarterbacks that they had relationships previously. Yeah. I think that was really smart on attacking that. And I actually did a feature on Daniel Kalen talking to his quarterback coach. And he said the same thing, was that Daniel Kalen, when he got into the portal, Taylor Lamb was one of the first ones to approach him. And it was, he remembered the relationship that they had when he was a high school quarterback. And, he ended up choosing Nebraska, but that was a hometown team. But he really liked Virginia during his high school recruiting process. So that relationship is in both quarterbacks, which is good in this portal era. It's hard for us to do that. Usually the relationships aren't there and you're kind of trying to build a relationship in a day or two. This was two quarterbacks that Virginia had significant relationships previously. So that you expect that to help a little bit when you go into a spring ball of trying to kind of get things going really, really quickly. And they're going to want to, because they also have to see the chemistry between the quarterbacks and their skill players at the wide receiver position, because they lose Malachi Fields, who transferred over to Notre Dame. They were able to bring 3 wide receivers, Jaden Thomas kind of coming in under the wire right there in the last day where he was able to get in the classrooms. So when you look at that wide receiver room, it's an interesting one because J.R. Wilson's gone, Jaden Gibson's gone. Obviously, I mentioned Malachi Fields. So it could be a whole new crop of guys who are going to get on the field early. When you look at, Cam Ross, Edrin, I feel like those guys could possibly see one of the guys get the reps with the ones. And then you look at the slot position, Cam Ross can fit in the slot. So that means what's going on with Derek Harrison, Cam Courtney. So that's a lot of position battles at the wide receiver position.
Yeah, I think it's probably a pretty big spring for Sudarian Harrison, right? He seems like going into his 3rd year now. You kind of remember when he flashed his potential as a freshman. Then he was hampered a little bit by a hamstring injury going into this past season, but just never really kind of hit that potential that he had flashed as a freshman 2 seasons ago. I think with all the new talent coming in, there's got to be some pressure on the guys who have stuck around and want to be part of the program going forward, right? There's some pressure on Harrison and even Cam Courtney. He's younger, but to some extent to kind of get going and be in a contributing role. I think that slot position is so fascinating because Thomas can play there too, right? He can play some slot receiver if they want him to play there. Ross obviously has the track record of doing so. He's caught for almost 1,800 yards in his career between 5 seasons at Connecticut and 1 season at James Madison. So to me, because of what they've done, it's highlighted that kind of that not make or break time for some of those guys who have been here at Virginia for multiple years, but certainly applies a little bit of pressure. I think Ed Ryan, who's in from Purdue, he fits the Malachi Fields role as that bigger, 6'3", 210, 215 pound target that you can throw the ball to on a possession opportunity. That makes sense to me. Thomas can play. And I think Virginia, it's also important to get Trell Harris back to top form after he missed most of this past season. He was a player they really, really missed. And I think it kind of changed a little bit of the trajectory of their season when they didn't have that deep ball threat to throw to for 8 weeks. He got hurt in the Maryland game, didn't return to the Virginia Tech game. I think they're still really high on him and know the potential's there. And everybody saw it. Caught a touchdown against Richmond, caught a touchdown against Wake Forest. He's a good player, and you just got to get him on the field.
Yeah, I mean, you saw the offense, how different it was when you had him and Malachi Fields. You had a different offense out there, right? It opened things up for both of them. And then as soon as Trell Harris was hurt, I mean, there was a reason why I had him as a breakout player potential last year before his injury. I mean, Virginia certainly missed him a lot. So the wide receiver position is very intriguing for me in the spring. I feel like this is one of the first springs since I've been back on the beat that I feel like there's position battles across the board in several of the positions because of so many new faces. And we're going to take a quick break here because there's a lot of new faces on the defensive side of the ball that we're going to touch on after this break. And welcome back to the Good Old Podcast. I'm Jacquie Franciulli, joined by Greg Madia from the Daily Progress, and we're previewing spring ball. We kind of touched on a lot on the offensive side of the ball with a lot of new faces coming in for Virginia, but the defense also saw a lot of reinforcements. We touched on the O-line depth when we discussed the trenches in the first half of the show. But Greg, you touched on it earlier too. Virginia reinforced the defensive line as well, focusing in and bringing in edge rushers because they knew pass rushing was an area of weakness last year for UVA. They didn't get to the quarterback as much as they did. They couldn't pressure the quarterback, which put a lot of stress on their secondary. But then also they realized they needed more depth on the inside, and then they also bought veterans back on that side of the ball. So it was a win not only in the portal, Greg, on the defense, but also
Yeah.
keeping veterans at home.
Yeah, I think for me, you look at it and you think they've probably got, just based on track record and pedigree of the guys they brought in, they've probably got 2 times more playable depth on the defensive line than they had not only last year but the last few years,
Mm-hmm.
and that's important. Tony Elliott has spoken often throughout his tenure at Virginia about wanting to get to that point where you're rolling guys in and out on the defensive line and keeping that unit fresh in an effort to get after the quarterback, stop the run, and maybe Virginia finally has it. Maybe you got to see if the guys can produce in a UVA uniform, but based on track record of the three, they brought in 3 edge rushers. Kazim Moore led Elon in sacks this past season and tackles for loss. Fisher Kamak, he had the crazy stat line in the bowl game: 3 sacks, 4 tackles for loss for UNLV in their Alley Bowl victory. And then Mitchell Melton didn't play as much at Ohio State, but when you're on a national championship team, you have that postseason experience to lean on, and there's probably a little more opportunity to play at Virginia than there is Ohio State for Melton, former star at Good Counsel, one of the great parochial school programs in the DMV. And then you look at the interior of the D line. One player I'm really intrigued about is Jacob Holmes from Fresno State. I was looking at it the other day, and Holmes had 8.5 sacks over the last 2 seasons with Fresno. In the last 2 years, can you guess how many sacks Virginia's interior defensive line combined for? Defensive linemen. Out of all the interior guys they played, how many sacks?
Oh man, like 4?
5.5. 8.5 for Holmes over the last 2 years as an interior defensive lineman. 5.5 for Virginia's interior defensive lineman combined. Like, to me, how does he fit in, and how can he impact that pass rush from the middle of the defense? That could make a big difference, and I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued by him to see what he could do, and also help free up some of the edge guys.
Yeah, Jacob Holmes is one of those guys who kind of came in under the radar a bit. It
Yeah,
still is, just because if you look at all, like, obviously Fisher Kamak received a lot of attention when he committed to Virginia from UNLV. Hunter Osborne, obviously coming from Alabama in the
yeah,
interior, he's a versatile guy that can play outside and inside. Obviously, Elliott mentioned he's playing inside, but another guy who picked up a lot of fanfare. Also, Jameer Carter returning picked up a lot of fanfare. Obviously, Jason Hammond coming back, Anthony Britton coming back, Mekhi Buchanan being healthy and him coming back. You have and Terrell Jones also.
Jameer Carter.
Like, you have a lot of other guys who have
Yeah.
been discussed a lot, but Jacob Holmes has not been discussed as much. And like you mentioned, he is an intriguing option for a team that wants to put pressure on the quarterback. And look at all the names we talked about, Greg. That's how many names are going to be in the pot for reps in the spring, and also for Virginia to have that depth that they lacked. I mean, Virginia was in a situation, of course, the last 3 years. If there was an injury, they had to do some stitching on trying to figure out how to do this. I mean, you had guys like Terrell Jones and Ben Smiley going inside and outside, depending on the package, trying to figure out what type of package they can do so they can create some pressure. But because they didn't have number 1 or number 2, they were down to number 3 or 4 guy. I mean, Billy Kadelka had to go in as a freshman walk-on and come in, and kudos to Billy. He's a talented guy. He's got a big body, but you don't expect as a freshman walk-on to come in and have play significant reps.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great point. They just didn't have it, and on top of it, like, they weren't getting the production from their older guys that they probably had anticipated. Right? Chico Bennett and Cam Butler had they combined for a pretty good 2022 when they were on the field together, and then Bennett was playing through injuries in 2023. Butler got hurt in 2023 when he was playing probably his best football. Like, those first 4 games before he got hurt in 2023, he was really, really playing well. This past season, they just didn't generate the pass rush that you probably thought they would have generated. But even still, you move on as a program, and now you've got some guys who you think might help you from a little bit better in the pass rush department.
For sure. And then we got to shout out for Jason Hammond, who worked tirelessly in the portal. I mean, every time, I know, Greg, you did the same thing. Every time you talk to somebody on the defense side of the ball, you heard Jason's name.
Well,
He's
like the thing
involved with everybody. Him and James Jackson. I will say James Jackson was also someone who was really crucial in these conversations. Like when Maddox Marcellus
Yeah.
obviously had that connection with Jason Hammond, being guys, from the
Clark.
Sunshine State. But
Yeah.
James Jackson was very involved in that recruitment too, and that helped get that linebacker depth because you got Trey McDonald who had off-season surgery. You had Cam Robinson who's had dealt a lot of surgery. I mean, and injuries the last 2 years. And then James Jackson, who's also had injuries. So adding Maddox Marcellus was also good in the linebacker room.
I think too, like, you got to give Hammond credit. Like, he's recruiting guys who play his own position.
Right.
And you thought going into last year, like, he could be a multi-year, multi-season starter for Virginia. There are no guarantees with what not only Virginia has coming back in Jameer Carter and Anthony Britton, who Britton played really, really well, I thought, as one of the team's more improved players as the season went on in 2024. But now you've got Holmes in the mix. You've got Hunter Osborne in the mix on the interior of the defensive line. So Hammond out there recruiting his own position probably understands it's for the betterment of the team, but maybe not, maybe not for his own personal gain. So I think that's a credit to him, and maybe shows like there's some culture within Virginia building that the players who are there understand. They have to get more better players in order to compete and start winning some more games.
That's actually what Hunter Osborne said when we spoke to him after his decision to commit to Virginia and transfer to UVA. And one of the things he said, the reason why he was so interested in UVA was because Jason Hammond was so adamant that he wanted Hunter to come to Virginia, and Hunter was flabbergasted. Hunter said that I've never seen a fellow defensive tackle try to recruit another defensive tackle to join him because I'm going to be competing with them. He was very intrigued by a program that had players that wanted that competition. So Jason Hammond really had a big effect on Hunter. Obviously, Kevin Downing, Tony Elliott were big guys in this recruitment, with Kevin Downing sealing the visit through a Zoom call. But at the end of the day, Jason Hammond, player-to-player recruitment was big with Hunter, just because of that idea that there's this guy who's trying to recruit a competitor. So that was a big deal for him. So Jason doing that, like, it is a point that you just made, that was a really big deal for him.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. And you hear often coaches say, like, the best recruiters sometimes are the players within the program, not only with the high school ranks, but now at the transfer ranks. And I think that makes a difference, especially when these transfers have such little time to decide where they're going, right? It's a very, very quick turnaround from the point they get in the portal to the time they've decided on their next destination. So any positive information or real life examples and feelings that a player in the program can share is probably to the transfer's benefit and might help them make a decision.
Yeah, and we talked about a position group that was heavily recruited in the D-line group, both the D end and D tackle. They added one linebacker, but I think a position that we still have more questions is going to be the secondary between corner and safety, because yes, you return Antonio Clary, but he's not going to be available in the spring because he had his off-season surgery. And then you have no more Jonas Sanker. You do not have Corey Thomas. So the returners, Antonio Clary is not available. So you're seeing Dre Walker, how healthy he is coming into the spring. He's had some injury issues while at Virginia. You have the new guys in Devin Neal and Jace Pavard. So where would they slot? Obviously, you could see Devin Neal at safety, but Pavard can play nickel. He's had some experience there. Will he be just an outside corner? Where do they kind of slot him? Ethan Minter, is he going to be that guy who could play that star position? Because who do they have to play that role? Is it Kiki Adams? Maybe he's a guy that can come in. A lot of question in that group, and a lot of depth concerns I still have in that group. I think they wanted to possibly add another corner to the mix during the first, foray into the portal. They didn't quite find someone to fit that role. So I think this is a position where I'm interested to see is how confident they are at those rotations.
Yeah, I think Caleb Hardy's another name. Flashed as a freshman 2 years ago. Didn't see as much of him this past season. Where is he in his development? Can he be a contributor at safety for them? I think Devin Neal, and from what he told me, is he's going to play the Jonas Sanker position. He's going to play that role. And so this spring for him, and he's got a lot of experience. Spent time at Baylor, was at Louisville previously. This spring for him is really about acclimating to Virginia's defense. I don't think he has to be Jonas Sanker. I think he can lean on his own experience to find his own success at Virginia and play that position. Who steps into Corey Thomas's position is really the question there as far as the safeties go, and really the secondary, because there's nobody on the roster that's 6'5", right, 6'5", 6'4", rangy, long, but can also rush the passer, can play in coverage, can act as a linebacker. There's no one on the roster that probably has that skill set. So you wonder how not only Virginia tries to fill that position, but maybe how they alter the defense a little bit to fit their personnel. And then I think corner, Prevard reminds me a little bit of how they brought Jam Jackson in last year. He's that taller 6'2", 6'3" size cornerback that Virginia prefers and likes in their defense as longer, a little bit rangier, who can play and cover. Can he just adapt to the FBS level? Jackson was able to do it last year in the spring, and now Prevard, he can take the time to show that he's capable of it. Jackson ended up being a good player for them. I know fans got on him at times, but I thought he ended up being a pretty good player for them. Started every game at corner. Really emerged into somebody they could rely on defense. He was healthy. He was out there. I don't know what else you could ask. Occasionally, a corner is going to get beat, but I thought Jackson played pretty well for them last year.
I think he was voted by the players as most improved player on defense, if my memory serves me right. I think he won one of the awards from the football players when they voted at the end of the season.
I know Britton got one of those for most improved. I don't know if Jackson did too, but maybe.
I think Jam Jackson was voted with one award. I remember seeing his name.
I thought he was good. I thought he was a little underrated last year.
I think the issue too is when you look at, obviously corners and safeties are always going to get the most criticism just because they're the last line of defense, right? They're going to see the most one-on-one battles. They're going to be the one that gets plastered everywhere if you get a big play on you, right?
Yeah.
Virginia's issue is always, it starts up front. That's always been the thing in the defense. If you don't get pressure on the quarterback, it always starts up front, because if things don't going right in the front, then things are going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So I think Virginia really realized that. That's why they reinforced. But to your point, I think it is the Corey Thomas question. Who can fill that role? I mean, Antonio Clary technically can. I mean, he has done that role.
Yeah.
And I think Ethan Minter is an intriguing option just because. But the thing is, he's only been playing that role for a year. He's only been playing safety for a year. And kudos to him for already having his first interception and, being able to rep at that position in his first year at Virginia and playing that position. But that's my biggest question is they don't have the experience there. There's a lot of question marks. And that's the biggest thing in the spring is trying to see where these guys are and to see how much you need to go into that spring portal. Because last year, the spring portal was very different. We didn't see any Virginia player enter. And Virginia wasn't as aggressive in the spring portal. But will they be more aggressive this year? Will we see more Virginia players go in? Those are the type of questions that we're still going to be monitoring over the course of the next 2 months.
Yeah, I think it's safety. Those three starters, assuming health, are probably Minter, Neal, and Clary, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when Clary returns to full health.
Hardy is probably the guy who plays in his role when Clary's hurt.
Yes. So, I mean, that's what it looks like to me at this point. So it's a matter of, how you figure out which ways the defense will work without a player like Thomas available. That to me is what's interesting. I don't think they have enough depth at corner. I mean, I think that's what's clear, unless Drake Walker is going to be healthy. And that's a big time question because he just hasn't been healthy the first 2 years of his career.
And where's Kevin Gray and his development too? And Kiki Adams, the safety.
Kiki Adams, yeah, I think Kiki Adams. You heard a lot of good things about him last year.
Yeah, you hear a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of the secondary is probably the position that I have the most questions on when it comes to this Virginia roster, and to see what's next in the kind of recruitment phase or development phase. Before I let you go, Greg, this was an intense portal coverage for you and me. It was very different than the portal. It feels like every year the portal coverage is different and how the schools approach is how we report it as reporters. It was definitely a different experience how much agents were involved this go around.
Yeah.
And just like how everything kind of changed with the law in Virginia where the collectives can help negotiation, but with it was definitely different.
Big time. I mean, players in some cases, if you wanted to talk to them, you had to go through their agent. Other players, they were more old school's not the right term, but kind of like the previous cycles where you just you just talk to them without having to go through a handler or an agent or however you want to term it. I thought it was fascinating though, and it shows how quickly the sport is changing. And how it's probably going to change. Not probably, how it definitely is going to change before the next winter portal. I don't think it'll be too different this spring. But I think, by the time you get to January, there'll be some differences when you go around next year, and either have a condensed timeline or it's later. So there'll be some kind of changes coming. But I thought this was fascinating. I mean, it really is nonstop. And there were, rumblings before the portal window opened that Virginia was going to be a serious player. And then the donation, of course, impacted that further. And it really impacted the caliber of player they could go after. Behind the scenes, I had heard that, Virginia wanted to go after players. And a lot of times you hear the academic reasoning thrown around at Virginia is why they might not be able to get a player or two. I had heard behind the scenes that, why can't Virginia go after kids who had been at Notre Dame and been at other good academic schools, Ohio State, and had some of that. Now they had the money to do that. And you see, you're not going to have trouble getting a kid in from Notre Dame and Jaden Thomas or Ohio State after the national title game and Mitchell Melton. They were able to go after players who were really highly sought after. The donation helped. And when you go after players that big, and that sought after, it shows your commitment to football. And I think that's a promising sign for Virginia fans as the Hoos move forward.
Yeah, and it felt like the aura changed after that donation.
I think as the first couple of commits, the Chandler Morris one obviously was a big one. Monroe Mills too. And it just the momentum for them in the portal just kept kind of building. And there were a few they missed out on. Right, Wallace Unamba wasn't named early.
Oh,
that was an interesting recruiting saga a little bit. Who ended up at Kentucky, but maybe their offensive line is maybe they've gotten better players because they didn't get him. They were able to get Mills and Wyatt and kind of solidify some serious D1 experience on the O-line after missing out on Unamba. But anyway, I felt like the momentum just kept kind of building for them as the portal season went on.
No, it did. And I feel like the only thing that the donation did, I feel like it opened doors for them, not only with certain guys who probably, maybe wouldn't even touch the Virginia when start negotiation, but also it gave permission to everyone to buy into football, I guess. It especially like every part of the department was all in. I mean, you saw, Tyler Jones in it. You saw the admissions.
What about the academic side, the admissions, like being able to get kids in that late after the title game?
I mean, they were still in it with Spindler too. I mean, it was a week after Jaden Thomas, and they were saying yes, he could get in the spring. Yeah. So I mean, that's what I mean when I say there was kind of a change after that donation. It felt like a permission for everyone to we're going to go all into this football program to get better, and it felt like everything happened after that donation.
Yeah, I think so, and some of the stuff and hearing about how negotiations work and They don't even bring kids to visit unless the money stuff has been figured out, or at least talked about in parameters, because nobody wants to waste each other's time. Hearing about a lot about the mechanisms of how the portal worked, and how Virginia's process was, I thought incredibly fascinating, and especially when you consider the time constraints to make it all happen. Not only are you racing to get kids into school, you're racing to beat other schools to the punch.
Right.
So I thought, with all that said, Justin Sparrows and his staff in the recruiting department did a really nice job, and you're seeing across the sport how important his role and other recruiting roles have become, since the portal has become such a way to acquire talent and flip your roster quickly.
Yeah.
And I think Virginia did a really good job this time around.
They did, and I know we had Lo Davis on the show, and he kind of described Cat Future's role in it, and how sometimes he was the first point of attack, he was the first point of contact, he was the first guy to approach, and Tyler Jones kind of helped him. He had a huge role in all this as well. You mentioned Justin, and even his role has kind of changed in the last few years. Most of the time, you don't have that personal connection with some of these guys going to the recruiting process, but we mentioned the quarterbacks, you did have those personal relationships. So even in high school recruiting, you can see where things have changed on the high school recruiting front. Sometimes you're recruiting a kid that you're thinking, I don't know if he'll come now, but maybe in a year or two, he might be coming in the portal. So you start that relationship in high school now, where in 5-6 years ago, you might say, I'm not going to waste my time on this recruit.
Not going to get that kid. Yeah.
But now you're like, well, I don't know. Maybe he'll come in 2-3 years in the portal. So it's definitely changed, and Virginia has adapted a little bit. It'll be interesting to see how the House settlement, whenever that occurs. I think we should be knowing at the end of April how that changes things as well. So like you said, next time we cover the portal, not in the spring, because the House settlement should be at the end of April. That's not going to change how the spring portal goes, but probably next December, we'll be having this conversation about something else that's changed and how everything's going to be different.
Yeah, and I think Tony Elliott's role should be mentioned too. I had asked him in February during one of his press conferences about how he stays involved with kids. When does he get involved? And he said, honestly, it really depends on the prospect. He pointed to Jamal Edrine as one player he wanted after watching his film. So he jumped in quickly and was in on Edrine right away. But with others, he'll let the position coach work it, and then will come in at the end or come in the middle. So I think that's neat when the head coach understands, where his value can be and when it needs to show up in the recruiting process with the transfer kids.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of it, Lo Davis is your first point of contact. Chandler Morris, it was actually, Justin Sparrows and Elliott, but Justin played a big role in that. I think Hunter Osborne was one that didn't mention Elliott because of his connection during his Clemson tenure as the OC, because Elliott was one of their best recruiters when he was at Clemson. He was involved in a lot of high-profile kids. So that connection from Clemson and that relationship that they had there. But obviously Kevin Downing was used a lot to guarantee that visit. It was the Kevin Downing Zoom that got Hunter Osborne. So a lot of moving pieces, and Virginia learned as they went. You saw them learn what works in the portal as you were covering them. You saw how they adapted with these changes, because it was very different for a lot of people. I mean, you saw how college programs were trying to figure it out as they went to, not just Virginia, it was everyone trying to figure out, because this was a very different portal. A lot more agents were involved than in previous times. And it was because, logistically, next portal, if there is a cap in revenue, agents they will be involved, but not the numbers that we saw.
Right. Because at some point the money has to stop if there's a cap.
Right. Yes. But
you gotta get the most while you can now, right?
Yes.
If you're an agent, that's that part of it.
Exactly. And we were seeing that. We're seeing that throughout. That it was a wild west, because people understood that this might be the last wild west when it came to the portal and exorbitant numbers. But Greg, I think we can talk about the portal for like an hour. So I think a lot of things were different. But I want to thank you for joining us on the show, previewing spring, and then talk a little bit about that portal coverage experience, because I know it it was a lot. It felt like it was 6 months long, but it was only 3 weeks. So it was great talking to you. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, Jacquie. Thank you.
All right. And remember, he's Greg Madia. You can see his work and read his work on the Daily Progress. And thanks again for joining us on this show. Again, we'll have more coverage on Wahoo's 24/7. We'll have full coverage from spring practice. And then obviously recruiting heats up again with visits starting up again. Visitors are locking in not only their spring visits, but their official visits. So if you head over to Wahoo's 24/7, there's already a pinned post at the top. So you know exactly when each player is visiting, not only the spring, but also in June. And Virginia has their first official visitor actually in the spring with 5-star offensive lineman Darius Gray already locked in April. So again, thank you everybody for listening in, and we'll see you next time. So for Greg Madia, I'm Jacquie Franciulli.